So Sunday is usually when I try and do more in-depth reading, and I have some more headspace to do that. And I always try and read the Caravan magazine, which is a long-form journalism magazine from India. And today I read a brilliant long-form reporting article from Irma Aga, who's a Caravan reporter, and she chronicles the impact and the consequences of the national education policy, which was brought into place by the Modi government in 2020, and what's been its implications, not just for young people, as we have seen in the form of now culminated into these Gen Z protests that happened last week, but also for the teachers, professors, and the educational institutions themselves, and the future of higher education in India. Reading the story made me feel very anguished, very distressed, and very upset as well. I'm not a student myself. I don't have kids, so it's not that I would be worried about their education. But I think just as a citizen of India and someone who cares about education deeply, and as someone whose parents invested as a priority in my education, and it's given me the kind of life that I'm living now, it was just super upsetting to read what's being done to our higher education system in the name of an ideology and in the name of power and money. And I want to share a few points that stood out to me from the article. The first one is that the clear disconnect between what the policymakers want and what the lived realities are on the ground. So, very simple example, and there's now recurring evidence that the national education policy already marginalizes communities and groups and students from groups that are already marginalized in India. So, the Dalit, the Adivasi, the low income background groups. But what it also does is it does not attempt to even understand what the realities of the students coming from these groups are when they're trying to compete or they're trying to attain higher education. So, for instance, one example that's shared in the story or in the reporting is about, there are a lot of online courses that are part of the implementation of national education policy across different universities in India and public universities. And many of these students don't have access to even laptops or smartphones to be able to do online courses. But what's worse is also that, the online courses are not live online training classes or, online classroom experience, which is live, but rather it's just recorded videos, which does not allow for any interaction, any questioning, or any kind of live engagement with the educator or the professor or the teacher. And so, lack of access to laptops, but also lack of access to this, engaged environment where you actually, experience education, is something that is completely absent now, as we see in the implementation of the national education policy. And what the reporting shows from Irma is that many students just miss the classes which are offered online, or even if the classes are online and they're just videos playing in the background while people are doing other things in life or catching up on their other assignments, because there's no way to have any kind of live engagement. The second point was that, and related point, which is that an education is supposed to stimulate intellectual curiosity, questioning, critical thinking. But the fact that these online courses do not have any live education component have completely erased this aspect of critical thinking and questioning together with other people in a live setting, and with the professor, with the teacher. But also, what the national education policy has done is it's brought in, I guess the intention was right in terms of making it more multidisciplinary, but the kind of courses that are being brought in are not necessarily helping students to gain that interdisciplinary kind of critical perspective and thinking. So, for instance, an example is undergraduates. So at universities, they are being taught how to do diary writing. I was just aghast to read that. I mean, in the age of AI and ChatGPT, we are teaching our bright, future to learn how to do diary writing. And I could understand if that was meant as like an intellectual exercise to, explore your thinking, your logical, your rational thinking. It would still make sense, but that's not the case here. Similarly, there was another example of how, pure modern mathematics has been expunged from the curriculum. And as one of the professors in the article cites, that, having that as a course enables people to do logical thinking, rational thinking, identify reasoning and logic in your argument and others' arguments. And by not having this course, I mean, you obviously see that the government is not interested in raising or in having a whole generation of people who can critically think and question. All they want are people who can be subservient, who can be, subjugated into a kind of thinking or indoctrinated into a kind of thinking. And the idea is not to enable critical thinking citizens, but really just a herd of people who just follow whatever is being told to them. And I think that's what the overarching, I think, the aim of national education policy is, because it's definitely not helping our students to actually even think for themselves. And when you see these students thinking for themselves, which brought them out onto the streets and protest for their rights, we hear from Modi that the students are misguided, or these are young people, these are children who are misguided, and that he forgives them. I mean, they're not seeking your apology. In fact, you should be the one apologizing. So this form of gaslighting is, I think the whole national education policy is actually a form of gaslighting students into believing that they're getting educated, but that's not the case. The third point that I also thought was very critical is that, the fact that the students are being pushed into taking these very over-centralized competitive exams to make it to colleges and universities. And you see that a lot of people are left out of that. And there's this whole in-depth aspect of the article where the reporter is also chronicling just the hassle of trying to register for these exams, or even being aware of what this exam means and how do you apply for it. And then once you know, how do you actually access the whole application process, the issues with identity documents, etc. And then once you have, even if you have managed to register, even being able to go to the center, and once you are at the center, what happens with the technology glitches, and how it's really ruining. Like, I if I was subjected, I think, and this is what the reporter said, and I think I could relate. I don't think I would have survived the way the system is set up right now. And in a very sad way, I understand and empathize why students have been forced to take their lives. The whole process is such a punishment that if you have failed and you have lost a whole year, whether it's through paper leaks or the fact you weren't even able to register, you weren't even able to get to the testing center. And if you went to the testing center, there were technological glitches that happened, or you were barred from taking a test for whatever reason, you lose a whole year, and then you have to do the whole thing all over again. It's absolutely brutal. I think it's like, I don't know how people are not able to understand the pain of these students who are forced to go through this system, who are put through this brutal, inhumane system of just trying to get basic education, which is their fundamental right as a citizen of India. So yeah, the third point is then linked to this over centralization, but how that over centralization is also pushing people to get private education. So, quitting public education uh, all the way and then just going into private institutions, which cost a lot of money, of course, and not many people in India can afford to send their kids to private education or private institutions. And this, and I think this is more of an indirect way to privatize education rather than actually bolster or strengthen or improve public education in India. And we also see that reflected in the statistics where the GDP share of what the government spends on education has dropped from almost 4.5%, if I'm correct, under Manmohan Singh government, to almost 2.5%. So rather than actually investing more in public education, this government has actually decreased its GDP share of education spending. And who is benefiting are these plethora of private institutions and the privatized education, with people having no choice but to spend lots and lots of money to be able to afford their kids a decent education. And even then, I'm not sure if it's decent education, to be very honest. There's a whole other story on what the education even in privatized institution looks like. But just to say that the public education is being squeezed and disrupted and destroyed, while privatization of education is being emphasized under the national education policy. I think the last point I wanted to say, which has really stayed with me, is when policymakers themselves and the ministers and the government themselves are not confident of the higher education that their country offers, when most of their kids are studying in universities abroad in the US or in Europe. And the article outlines how even the education minister that just resigned, his own daughter studies at Tufts University in the US, and there Nirmala Sitharaman, whose child studies in Northwestern, and the foreign minister, their kid studies at Georgetown. So they have already sent their kids out to these well-renowned universities for a good quality education, while they're subjecting students and kids of their own country to this dilapidated, destructive higher education system, which is outlined in the national education policy, which is primarily a way to propagate the Hindutva ideology, the RSS BJP ideology, and to make people dumb, indoctrinated about a certain vision or glory of India, rather than having them keep up with what the world looks like right now and how rapidly the world is changing now. And I think this has been the most difficult aspect of how and why this policy even came into being, and to understanding that this is a very intentional step from this government to ruin the minds of the future of this country, all in service of an ideology that benefits few powerful and few wealthy people, while their own kids study in universities abroad. And I think that really tells you how this government values education. And of course, now we all see it with the brutal police violence that's been enacted against the students who were protesting, and all the gaslighting that's happening, all the blame that's being put on them for using abusive language and profanity, etc., while all the distractions, helping to not look at what is actually the national education policy doing. And this article, if you're able to read it, it's behind a paywall, but if you're able to read it, I really recommend, because it takes you to the granularities of what this policy is doing on the ground, how it's ruining the future of our country, but also how it's it's really ruining the lives of students who deserve so much better uh, than what this government is able to give them.